Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Two stories from Worchester Street. There's a cult hidden in the English countryside. A few weeks back, I planned to visit the UK. I'm a photographer, and I hope to get some shots of historic buildings. I didn't want to visit any big tourist trap places. No. I wanted my photos to be out-of-the-way buildings that were still very old. I looked around online and found mention of a place called the Eastgate Manor. It fit the bill perfectly. Old, remote, and not very well known. On top of everything, I found out it was now operating as a hotel. I looked for a site to book my stay, but I found they didn't have one. I was determined, though, and after a short phone call with a polite British man, I'd booked my stay. My drive took me out north of London, into the winding foothills and forests. The landscape was dotted with occasional village, but the further I drove, the more remote it got. I drove for what seemed like a few hours before finally reaching the right village. It was getting late and I was hungry, so I stopped by a bakery to grab some food. The air inside the bakery was sour somehow, like milk that had gone bad or body odor. When I rung the bell to buy my food, a man emerged from the back of the shop. There was something off about him. Nothing that would turn your head if you were walking down the street, but I couldn't help notice that his skin was pale, and his fingers and arms both seemed a little too long. He didn't say a word, just rang me up and nodded at my muttered thanks. I finally reached Eastgate Manor. It was far better than I'd hoped. Old stone walls, a parapet. Just breathing the air of the grounds was enough to get a sense for the history of the building. I took this picture of the building. Walking into the manor was like walking into another century. A crackling fireplace set in one corner, made of rough-hewn stone. The entire scene was ripped straight from a painting. A man stood up from a chair by the fire. He was thin and wore a suit and tie. I watched him warily, but he stuck out his hand and asked me if I was the guest who'd booked the room. I shook it and introduced myself. I didn't like the feel of the man. I shot a glance down at his fingers and saw they were too long, just like the man from the bakery. I put it out of my mind. Maybe this town had a small gene pool or something. He led me to my room and unlocked the door. He turned to me and said, "I'm locking the front door of the manor. If you need to leave for any reason, feel free to ring the bell on the desk downstairs, and I'll be there to unlock it for you." I thanked him, unpacked, then jumped in my bed. I lay there for a few hours, unable to sleep. I got up and paced, trying to clear my mind. When that didn't work, I headed for the window and pushed the panes apart. The night air was crisp and damp, and I stood there for a moment, just taking in the breeze. When I opened my eyes, though, I saw red on the horizon. I looked closer, trying to make out what it was. The edge of a forest sat a few hundred yards from the manor. In the distance, I saw a massive column of smoke rising and a red light that lit the underside of the clouds. I didn't think it was a forest fire. The region was far too damp for that to be likely. I couldn't sleep and was feeling adventurous. So I threw on a jacket and slipped out the window. The rough stone was easy enough to climb, and soon I was on the ground making my way towards the trees. I walked through the woods for a quarter of a mile. Up ahead, a clearing in the trees was lit by the largest bonfire I'd ever seen. The bonfire was 30 feet across at the very least, and the flames licked up 40 feet. I could feel the heat even from my spot in the woods. I briefly considered moving forwards, but then I saw them. A few dozen people were gathered around the fire. All of them had long limbs I'd noticed earlier, were pale, and all wore masks on their faces. I froze, not knowing what to do. I could make my way back, but something told me I should stay. I swung myself up into a tree nearby and didn't stop climbing until I'd reached the height of the flames in the clearing. I stared down, transfixed. The figures were holding food over their heads in a motion that reminded me of priests offering a sacrifice. One by one, each moved towards the dense grove of bushes and trees, dropping their offerings at the edge of the far wood. My eyes aren't perfect, but I think they were dropping arms, human arms. I pulled out my phone and tried to take a picture, but it slipped out of my hand and tumbled to the ground some 40 feet below, hitting a downed branch covered in leaves. It rustled loudly. The figures surrounding the fire stiffened at the sound and began moving towards me. They fanned through the woods, staring up into the trees around me. I was a dozen feet from the edge of the clearing and high up in the tree, so I hoped they'd missed me. I'd long since learned that no one ever looked up when they're searching for someone. On top of that, their night vision had no doubt been ruined by the fire. While I held my breath at the top of the tree, a new sound came from the opposite side of the clearing, near where they left the sacrifices. It was a thunderous crashing sound, as if a massive creature was walking through the bushes. Branches twisted and snapped, and the figures broke out in a wail of despair. I stayed in the tree until sun came up the next morning, long after the last figure had left me behind. I snuck it back into Westgate Manor, grabbed my stuff, and drove out of there. I've done some research since then. There's a long history of occult stuff happening in the town surrounding Eastgate Manor, and apparently people regularly are reported as missing, but they only disappear 1 week a year. Which week was that? It was the week I'd booked my stay. During my investigation, I discovered a creature I can't explain. I've been working as a private eye here in New Hampshire for a few years now, and I'm good at what I do. You might have an image in your head of a noir detective, but to be honest, I work with far more cheating spouses than backlit alleys. I was sitting in my cramped office one afternoon when a girl walked in. She introduced herself as Bethany. She had bright red hair, freckles, and looked to be around 14 years old. "What can I do for you, Bethany?" I asked, gesturing for her to take a seat. She sat down, gripping a small white envelope as if she was afraid it would float away. "My brother Nick has been missing for a few days, and I'm worried about him." She was young, but her eyes were hard and calculating. They swept around my office before returning to me. Something about her reminded me of my little sister Jane when she was at this age. "Missing person cases are handled by the police," I said. "Why don't you go to them? They'll investigate for free." "No!" she nearly shouted. "I can't." "Why not?" "I just can't." I set my hands on the desk, waiting. Most people hate silence and fill it in on their own. After a long moment's hesitation, she continued. "My brother and I are orphans. We spent 11 years in foster homes. My brother turned 18 last year and became my guardian. We left the foster homes and got our own apartment. If the police find out he's missing, though, she trailed off. You go back to a foster home until they find him, I finished. Don't you have anyone you trust? Any family friends? No, she said, and shot to her feet. She passed the envelope across my desk. I won't go back to those homes. And like I said, I have money to pay you. I opened the envelope and saw an assortment of $1 and $5 bills. It couldn't have been more than $50 in total. I looked up at her and saw that she was fighting back tears. She was a small thing sitting in my armchair, scared and pitiful. A wave of protectiveness towards her swept over me, and I passed her back the envelope. You don't have to pay until we find him, I said. Relief shone in her face. She accepted the money, stuffing it back into a pocket. It made me question whether she would have had enough to eat if I'd kept it. I spent the next few minutes going over where her brother might have gone. According to Bethany, Nick had been searching for any living relatives. The night he disappeared, he'd been heading for a promising address he'd found. She didn't know exactly where it was, just that it was in Vermont. All I had to go on was their first name, their last name, and the dates of their birth. Searching all the hospitals and census for their birth certificate would be a mammoth task. From there, finding an address from their parents' names would be another job entirely. For most people, it would take weeks or months to do all that. I'm not most people. I won't bore you with the details, but just let me say, it took me the better part of an afternoon. I sent Bethany to the store with a 20 to bring back some coffee for me and Pop-Tarts for her. She returned, and just as the sun began to get low in the sky, I managed to find a birth certificate for her. Your parents' names are Henry Ives and Juliet Ives, I said. She nodded. I think I remember hearing that once. Another quick search brought me a property in Vermont. A property apparently still owned by the now deceased Juliet and Henry Ives. I tapped my screen. I think I found a good place to search for your brother. Now why don't you head home and let me check the place out? I'll be back tomorrow and let you know what I find. Bethany shook her head. I'm coming with you, I sighed. Bethany, didn't anyone tell you not to trust strangers? Her eyes hardened again. I had to live with strangers every day for 11 years. Don't lecture me about strangers. I raised my hand in apology. She shook her head and continued. Anyway, if you don't take me, you don't get the money. I sighed, not bothering to tell her that $50 wouldn't even begin to cover my normal fees. Fine, I said. To be honest, I was thinking she'd be the only person who'd be able to identify Nick's body. People rarely disappear. Most of the time, when they do, it means they've been in a car accident. I half expected this excursion to end at a local morgue, with Bethany identifying Nick's body. I shook the thought from my head. Who knew what we'd find? We loaded up into my car and set off up I-89. The sun set and a full moon rose, covering the landscape with a pale white light. The drive took us deep into a forested area. Soon the road turned bumpy, but after another few minutes driving, we were there. The house was massive and clearly abandoned. The entire area was lit up with moonlight, so much so that I was able to take this picture. The entire building oozed a feeling of unease. The corners of my mouth twisted as I watched the gnarled trees surrounding the building. Something about it made me feel sick to my stomach. Bethany gasped. I whirled around, bringing up a flashlight, half expecting to see something between the trees. Instead, I saw a motorcycle leaning against a tree beside the road. "That's Nick's motorcycle," Bethany said, her voice excited. "He's got to be here." "Or was here, at least," I said. I didn't know what to make of it. Had Nick been spending a few days and nights here in this house? I tossed Bethany my flashlight and told her to stay behind me. We made our way up the mossy steps. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it opened easily. I stepped inside, the entryway lit up by the moonlight that streamed through the large upper windows. I lit my phone's flashlight, all the same. "Nick," I shouted into the house. "I'm here with your sister Bethany. You hear?" There was no response. I took a few cautious steps into the house. The outside was clearly abandoned, but the inside looked pristine. I rubbed my finger across the mantel in the living room and felt no dust. I picked up the single picture frame that sat there, shining my light into it. A man and a woman with bright red hair smiled back at me, clearly siblings. Both were the spitting image of Bethany. I handed the picture to her and continued into the house. "Nick!" I shouted again. I took a picture of the living room on my phone. Bethany passed beside me, taking a few steps towards the hallway. "Nick!" she shouted, her voice shrill. She turned to me, her face thoughtful. "This place looks familiar to me." Then a wet, slithering voice came echoing down the hallway. "Miss Bethany, it's good to see you again. Though seeing Master Nick again was also so unexpected." He spoke with a mid-Atlantic accent. It sounded like something from the 1920s. A faint dripping sound came from the darkness. I reached forward and pulled Bethany back behind us. Still holding my phone in one hand, a dark silhouette appeared in the hallway, limping as it walked towards us. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice catching in my throat. Some part of my mind was screaming at me to run, telling me that "who are you" was the wrong question, telling me that "what are you" would have been better. "What have you forgotten, Bethany? We served house Ives for generations, giving counsel and, when necessary, correction." As he spoke, water dribbled from his mouth and splattered against the carpet, as though he were salivating. He took one last step forward, stepping into the moonlight, still streaming into the house by the upper windows. He wore an old-fashioned butler suit, but his nose, mouth, and throat all looked as if they'd been torn away by rats. The top of his head was bald, pale, and shone like a lamp in the moonlight. Each of his fingers were long and spindled, resembling tree roots or octopus tentacles more than human fingers. I squeezed the camera on my phone, taking a picture. Here's the picture I took of the creature. He smiled and leaned forward, shambling towards us again. I spun, threw Bethany over my shoulder, and sprinted for the door. The dripping, slithering sound grew louder and louder in my ears as I raced for the door. I slammed the door shut behind us and almost fell as I made my way down the mossy steps, still carrying Bethany. I reached the car, tossed her inside, and turned the engine over. When I looked up at the house, I saw the door wide open. I threw the car into drive, reverse, and drive again as I spun the car around. We shot down the bumpy, dark road as fast as I could, without losing control. We spent a long moment not speaking. Bethany began sobbing quietly where she sat. I looked over and saw she was still holding the photo I'd taken from the mantel. I let her cry for a while, just driving back to our city. When she stopped, I cleared my throat. "Listen," I said, "my sister Jane has a house nearby. Why don't I drop you off there for the night? I don't think it's good for you to be alone." She nodded. I called my sister and made the arrangements, and soon we were there. Jane came out and helped her into the house, talking of watching a movie together. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. I looked over at the seat where she'd been sitting and picked up the picture frame. I undid the back and pulled the picture out to examine the back of the photo. There was a small message written, "Juliet and Brad, December 2003. Brad Ives. He must be Bethany's uncle. Maybe he was still alive. I'm going to contact him to see what I can find out about everything. Whenever I learn anything else, I'll update you all here." So quoth this raven. I hope you're all having a wonderful Saturday, and I thank you all for coming to visit me. And a special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Charlotte Emerson, Ermin Case, Darren and Jennifer, and Laura. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings. Farewell.